This actually happened to me a few years ago. I started working at a local gas station part-time after high school. I figured if I'm staying home, might as well do something productive and make my own money too. Most shifts were at night, so they were either dead or full of drunks, but I usually worked with one other person, so it wasn't too bad, especially when we had people get out of hand. I actually liked it for the most part. On the slow nights, I let the neat freak come out in me and I started to organize the shelves better so that everything is lined up right, not scattered around and piled up. There was one guy, Mark, that usually worked the night shifts with me, and he'd play music on his phone, so it wasn't completely silent, which was nice. One downfall, though, was that I didn't have a car anymore, as mine finally died on me, so I had to rely on rides from my parents, friends, or sometimes an Uber to get me to places. Still, it was manageable because I only lived a few miles away from my home, so I could even walk there. I believe it was in late September when this happened because it wasn't too hot, but it started getting cooler overnights. I had decided to walk to work since it was nice out and my parents weren't home to take me anyways. It was a normal shift, except it was also football season, so we were a bit busier before games started, dead while it was on, and then we'd get a quick burst of people at the end. As I'm ringing people up, I looked up to see my line and I noticed a guy in basketball shorts, socks with sandals on, and a shirt that said something about a gun show. Eye roll, am I right? He was looking right at me and smiling, so I just smiled back and continued working on the line. After a few, I looked back and noticed the line wasn't going down, so I called for Mark to come up and help. Sandal Guy was up next. I noticed he had one of those tall cans of tea and nothing else, and he was still smiling, so I just said, "Sorry you had to wait for just this." Without taking his eyes off of me, he said, "Oh, it's all right, sweetie, as long as I get to see your beautiful smile." I haven't really dated much, nor have I had much experience in flirting, so I didn't really know how to react. Not to mention, he had to be close to my parents' age, so I just made some weird chuckle sound and didn't say another word. He paid with a card. I handed him his receipt without saying another word to him, and he said, "Good night, sweetie," and walked out. I didn't have time to process what happened as I had a few more people in line, so I just continued until we cleared out again. When I was done, I was about to ask Mark to help me with something when he said, "Oh, sure, sweetie." He was a nice guy. We never had problems with each other, so I knew he was teasing, but it snapped me back to that when I started laughing and asked, "So you saw that too? Was that not weird?" He said he thought the dude was weird, but the flustered side of me was adorable. Funny to him, but I didn't know what to say, and the guy was just off, so none of that was enjoyable. Our night went back to normal for a while. He was in the back again as he did some of the bookwork while I was messing with the shelves. We were kind of shouting back and forth about something that we were both really involved in when someone came in. I started walking back around the corner when I noticed it was Sandal Guy again. He noticed me and waved, so I waved back, and he started quickly walking towards the coolers in the back. I quickly made a comment to Mark about him being there and just waited for the dreadful checkout. He walked up to the counter and said, "I forgot to get gas." If that was the case, why did he walk to the back? I just smiled and rang him up. As I handed him his receipt, he made sure to reach further in to touch my hand and said, "I'm glad I decided to stop here tonight," and smiled as he shook my hand. My hand was limp because I wasn't interested in this at all. At this point, Mark had walked out from the back and said, "Hey Kate, my part's done, I'll take over." Thank God. I pulled my arm back real quick and dashed to the back and waited. I didn't hear another word from the guy, but I heard the bell on the door and then Mark walked to the back. He said when I turned around, the guy cocked his head like he was trying to look at my ass when he walked in front of his view. He said when he noticed this, he grabbed his candy and dashed out the door. Who does this right in front of people? Anyways, the rest of the night was okay again. Had some lady come in singing and got Mark to sing, so that was funny. So we were having a good time. It was getting close to closing, so Mark had taken the trash out back so he could smoke, and I was up front again reading a magazine. To my surprise, Sandals walks in again. It had to show on my face that I was not okay with this, but he again immediately smiled and was looking around quickly like he was trying to find something. That's when he grabbed another candy bar and said, "For you, Catherine Lee. I can't stay away. Can I give you a ride home so we can talk?" I was shocked. My name badge says Kate. I don't go by Catherine or my middle name, so how would he have known that? I didn't know how to reply, so I just said, "No thanks, I have a ride." To which he said, "But you walked here, right?" How would he have known that? I just told him I had a ride and he wouldn't stop, saying he wanted to get to know me more and take care of me. I remind you, I was around 19 years old, and this guy could have been my father. I tried cutting him off to ask him if he was going to purchase anything, when he tried to reach for my hand again, and I pulled back. At this point, Mark walked back in right as he started pleading. Mark immediately walked over to the guy, telling him he needed to leave. He started shouting as he was being pushed out that he'll wait for me. Mark locked the door and made sure I was okay, but I was just more shaken up than anything. He had me doing some other things from there, like more organizing, stocking anything that was empty, and mopping while he watched the door. He would unlock the door to let people in, then lock it again. At closing, he was finishing the last thing, so I had pulled out my phone and opened Facebook when I noticed I had a friend request. It was Sandals guy. That's when I figured out where he knew my name from and also realized that my address was on there. I told Mark about this and he suggested he take me home. I did not refuse either. As we left, I was looking around to see if he was waiting, but I never saw anyone. As he was driving, he tried to loosen up the tension and joke with me, but I think we were both worried about it still. Once we got to my place, the lights were on, so I knew my parents were still up, thankfully, and I noticed Mark was still there when I had gone in and locked the door. I thought it was just to make sure I got in okay. After I was in, I changed clothes and went to get something to eat when there was a knock on the door. It was the cops. They were explaining that there was a report of a suspicious person and gave a description of the vehicle and then the person. You know it. It was the same guy. So I had to explain to the cops and my parents what had happened. The cops said they would drive around a few times to make sure he didn't come back, and thankfully he didn't. But they did tell us that if he came back, to call them again. Unfortunately, there was little they could do since he hadn't actually done anything. The next time I worked, though, Mark explained what had happened. He said he noticed a car following us, but didn't want to say anything and scare me. After I got inside, he saw the truck turn the corner onto my road, so he got out of his car and noticed it was the same guy as he was driving by. He said he thinks he recognized him too as he started to speed up. So he had called the cops to report it for us. I was so incredibly thankful for what he did too. Thankfully, we never saw the guy again, so hopefully he got the hint, but you can bet I did a lot of cleanup on my Facebook too. My story is one that is pretty messed up, and I'm not saying that lightly. This was probably the lowest point of my life and was absolutely something that gave me some sort of PTSD, but it's an important story for me to tell to the world, in my opinion. I was abused and mistreated by this person, and it's a bumpy ride, so if that's not something you can stomach, I don't recommend reading the rest of this. I dated a guy named Cole for most of my time in high school. I met him at the end of my freshman year, and we actually started dating at the beginning of my sophomore year, and we were together until we graduated. Neither of us was one of the popular kids, and neither of us really stood out of the crowd, so we just kind of really enjoyed each other's company and being together with someone that was like me and really nice. Well, that's what it was on the outside, at least. To everyone in the school, my parents, and the public eye, we were just two shy high school kids that liked to hold each other's hands. In private, however, he was emotionally manipulative and horribly controlling. My home life wasn't great. My parents argued nonstop, and they were always so aggressive with each other, so I guess as I was growing up, I kind of connected that to love. So when Cole started doing the same thing to me that they did to each other, I thought it was normal. It didn't take long for that emotional manipulation to turn into physical abuse and then sexual abuse. Basically, if he wanted to do something, we would just do it, and I had to accept it because he loved me, and that was that. This went on for over a year and a half, until spring break of my senior year. I spent the week over at my grandmother's house in an attempt to get away from him, even for just a little bit, though I framed it that I hadn't spent time with Granny for a while, which was true. While I was there, my grandma actually saw a bruise that was on my inner thigh, and the whole thing spiraled. I broke down and told her everything. She was horrified to hear what had been happening between us, but once she calmed me down, she basically told me that I needed to exit the relationship as quickly as I could. We talked about it some more, and I agreed with her. She had convinced me that I needed to get away from Cole, and I needed to get away as soon as possible. Once spring break was over, he came over to my house, and I was adamant that we needed to spend time in the living room instead of my room, because I knew what would happen if we went behind closed doors. Throughout the evening, I just kind of sat alone on the couch and kept my distance while I prepared for what I had to do, and then, once he had to leave, I ended up telling him that I thought we should take a break from each other. I saw by the look on his face that he wanted to smack me, something he had pretty much turned into his rebuttal when he thought what I said was wrong, but he didn't, because my mom was in the other room and he had to keep up his good kid appearances. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to do that in a way that almost sounded threatening, but I nodded and said that I enjoyed our time together, but that I needed some time to think things through. He basically just left after that, but he did not leave me alone. He was dead set on winning me back in some way, whether that meant by telling me how much I meant to him or telling me that I would be sorry for what I had done. I tried my best to ignore the notes, the letters in the mailbox, the constant phone calls, but I couldn't ignore the literal brick through my window. Yes, he literally threw a brick through my window, complete with a small note that said, "I love you, Kayla, and I will die without you," complete with his signature. Thankfully, that was enough to make this whole thing a lot easier, as my dad called the cops and he was subsequently arrested because he admitted that he did it. I was actually happy that this happened because I would be able to move on, focus on school, and he wouldn't be there to distract or bother me. I thought that was where it would all end. He was charged, told to stay away, and I finished high school without any issues. After I graduated, I moved out and then moved in with my grandparents and went to college. I spent 4 years furthering my education and lived with them, then went and got my own place a few miles from their house at an apartment complex down the way. I lived there for 6 years, so at this point, I had been on my own for a decade, had started my own career, and had met a guy that I was dating, and things were pretty serious. Basically, I had moved on with my life, and I was happy despite what I had gone through. Recovery was difficult, but I felt like I had successfully managed to do so. Unfortunately, things went south really fast one random day when I got a phone call from a number I didn't know. I answered it, and I wish that I hadn't. As soon as I said hello, the voice on the other end said, "Hey, Kayla, it's Cole," in a tone that was way too excited to be on this call. As soon as he said my name, my blood ran cold, and there were legitimate chills running down my spine. This was a voice that I never wanted to hear again, and the fact that he had somehow found my phone number was something else altogether. I kind of sheepishly said hi, and then asked what he wanted. He laughed when I responded, then said something like, "Don't sound so excited to talk to me," then started in with what he was calling for. He asked me if I would be a reference for a job that he was applying for, because he needed someone to tell them that he was a good person and willing to do the work. I basically just said okay and wrapped the call up as quickly as I could. The feeling in my stomach was literally the worst thing that I had felt since he and I were together. I ended up telling my boyfriend what had happened, and thankfully he was fully supportive and willing to keep me calm and talk me through the situation. At the end of it, he pretty much told me that I should just not answer any numbers that I didn't recognize and just move on and pretend that it never happened. He then said that if I wanted, we could go up and change my number. I told him that it was okay and that I would just not answer any more calls that I didn't know. That would have been a great solution and would have been enough if what happened next didn't happen. About a week after that happened, I went into the office to work, and sitting in the lobby was Cole. I opened the door and literally just froze the second I saw him. My heart was racing, and I'm pretty sure I started hyperventilating because I was feeling dizzy. As soon as he saw me, he stood up and walked over to me, grabbing me and pulling me into a hug. I had no idea what to do. I just stood there, frozen, with his arms around me and not letting go. I wanted to cry. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to literally just stop existing. He was talking in my ear about how much he'd missed me since high school, how happy he was to see me. He said that he was there for an interview to work in the IT department, which was the department that I worked in, and said that he was so excited that he may be working with me. Then what he said made my heart stop. It could be just like old times. As soon as he said that, I immediately pulled myself away from him and walked away as quickly as I could to go and talk to my manager. I walked into his office, and I knew that he could see something was wrong because he stood up and asked if I was okay. I let loose, asking him if there was someone named Cole that was there for an interview. He told me that he was, and that he was there to interview for a position that was on our team, and then asked if I knew him. I explained everything to him. I pretty much just dumped the entirety of my trauma on him and told him that Cole was the cause of it. He then followed that up with saying that he would keep that in mind and asked me if I had a restraining order on Cole. I knew what this meant. It meant that he did not care and that he was going to proceed as if I never told him any of this. The restraining order question was a matter of covering himself legally. I told him no, and he ended the conversation pretty much right away. I went back to my desk, but I think I spent most of that day in the bathroom just staring at the wall and having a panic attack. That was the last day that I worked there, because I knew what was going on. Some of you may say that it was purely coincidence that he was interviewing for the same company that I was working at, but it wasn't. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He never once said anything about not knowing I worked there, and his comments made me feel more like he knew it and he was trying to pretend like he didn't. I know it sounds paranoid, but he got my number. He went to my office. He interviewed for a position on my team. None of this was a coincidence. Like I said, I ended up quitting that day. Didn't even put in my 2 weeks just in case. I wasn't willing to give him any more time around me. I also went and changed my number after that day, so he didn't have it. Thankfully, this time around, I had more of a support system in place. My boyfriend, my grandparents, and a few friends. They all supported me in my decision, and they helped me get my mind straight. So that's it. That's the story of my horrible ex that showed up randomly in my life 10 years later. It was hard to get through, and I still feel like someday he's going to show back up in my life to cause me more distress. Thankfully, he hasn't. If he ever does, I'm honestly not sure what I'll do or what it'll do to me. I have a story about an ex of mine that turned out to be a genuine creep and caused a lot of problems for me and my family. Some obviously needed context. I am currently in my late 20s, but when this happened, I was 18, and my ex, who we're going to refer to as Shane, was 20. He and I met because he worked at a local Starbucks because he was working there, and I had gone on a few times. We had spoken several times, and after a while, he ended up asking me for my phone number. From there, we went on a few dates, and I thought we had a good thing going for about 4 months. At the 4-month mark, I found out that Shane had actually been hooking up with another girl behind my back, and I wasn't really about that, so I ended it. To say that Shane was distraught is either an understatement or a misstatement about him in this scenario. When we broke up, he started acting hysterical. We had met up at the Starbucks where he worked, and I told him that I knew about his other girlfriend and that I was done with the relationship since he obviously wasn't serious about it. He exploded. He literally started screaming and crying at me, telling me that I was the only one that he needed in his life. And, of course, saying that he would have to end his life if he couldn't be with me forever. I basically told him that I was done. His cheating was enough for me, and I didn't want this anymore. He seriously then got on his knees and pulled a ring he had on his hand off his finger and screamed at me that I needed to marry him because that would prove that we were a forever thing. It was incredibly awkward, and the fact that he was screaming and bawling in public, something I would have never expected him to ever do based on the 4 months we were together. He seemed like a decent guy, and he seemed mentally stable. So this man was not the Shane that I had fallen for the few months prior. Anyways, to wrap that part up, I told him no and that I really hoped he had a great life, and that was the end of it for me. I walked out of the Starbucks and left him there, which, yes, I did feel bad for him, even though I shouldn't have. Obviously, this was not the end of this. This was just what set up the part where things went south really hard. About 2 days later, I was at work all day, and when I got home, no one else was there. It was a bit weird. Usually my younger sister was home. She was 15 at the time and was on summer break. Usually my mom would tell me if she went out with a friend or something, but I assumed that she had just forgotten and moved on. Then, a couple hours later, my mom got home, and when she asked me where my sister was, I told her that I had no idea, and told her that she wasn't home when I got home from work. There was a moment of panic, obviously, but then I paused and thought logically, I should just call her. I pull out my cell phone and push the button to dial her number, and she answers. I immediately asked her where she was, and what she said made my blood run cold. She told me that Shane had showed up in the middle of the day looking for me, and when she told him that I wasn't home, he asked if she wanted to go to the mall. She was with my ex at the mall. This 20-year-old guy had showed up and more or less kidnapped my 15-year-old sister. Yes, I'm using kidnapped in a loose way, but that's pretty much what it was. A 20-year-old man has no business taking a 15-year-old girl that he is not family with away from her home and going anywhere with her. He had more or less violated the trust that she had in him because she knew that he and I were dating, and we had only broken up a couple of days before this. So it wasn't like I was telling everyone that we weren't together anymore. I asked her to put him on the phone, and she did. I laid into him right away about how he needed to get her home immediately and how messed up it was that he would take her anywhere at all. He seriously laughed at me when I said this and told me that he wanted me to know how serious he was about us and that he wanted to spend time with my family. I asked him where they were and told him that I would come to get her right then, and that if he left or did anything, I would be showing up with the cops. At this point, I was screaming at him, and I was seriously holding back tears. He told me that they were just up the street at the Dairy Queen having ice cream, and that they weren't going to go anywhere. I don't think I had ever driven that fast in my entire life. And I'm glad that there weren't any speed traps in the blocks between the house and there. I pulled up and they were standing outside. I practically jumped out of the car and shouted at my sister to get in the car right then. She was pretty clearly confused, but she did what I asked. I went up to Shane and I was so very close to hitting him, but I ended up just telling him that if he ever tried anything like this again, they wouldn't have anything to bury. He seriously ignored what I said, got down on his knee, and pulled a ring out, asking me to marry him again. I slapped him hard, and I told him to screw himself. Then I got back in my car and took off. I then had to have a very awkward conversation with my sister why I rejected his proposal and why I smacked him, and I had to tell her that he had kidnapped her and that Shane and I broke up a few days ago. I'm pretty sure I soured her day tremendously because while I was explaining this, she went pale. I'm thankful that he hadn't done anything to her, but the fact that he had gone this far scared the living hell out of me. I should have told her that we had broken up, but I had been working and we hadn't spoken too much about anything those past few days. Maybe I should have called the cops about this, but the other part of my brain was telling me that he didn't do anything illegal. She went willingly, she knew who he was, and he didn't coerce or forcibly take her. I, of course, explained this all to my mom and dad, and let me tell you, my dad was ready to follow through on the threat I had made to Shane. I haven't seen Shane since this all happened, and I'm hopeful that he never did anything like this with anyone else. I have a story about an ex-girlfriend that went a bit crazy and really taught me a lesson about dating. Mainly to get the hell away from anyone that starts to throw red flags at you in high quantities over a short period of time. When I met Adeline, shortened to Lynn, I was immediately smitten. She was everything I wanted in a girl. She was a solid 10 for me, was super polite to literally everyone, loved the same things as me, and she didn't really have a wild side. I've always been a bit of a wallflower, so I wasn't looking for anyone that had a crazy social life or liked to be out in public all the time. Lynn was, as I got to know her over the couple weeks before we dated, perfect to me, and I fell super hard, super fast. She and I were very happy together for about 3 months. Things were perfect. She would stay at my apartment every weekend, and we were making plans for the future. Lynn seemed like she was the perfect partner for me, and I really thought that we had a very bright time ahead of us. Of course, with the good things come the bad. And around this time, my mother was hit with a cancer diagnosis, and me being her only child, I felt like I needed to commit a lot of time to her to help her where she needed. My dad hasn't been around since I was around 5, so a lot of it fell on my shoulders. I had no problem bearing this weight, as I love my mother, and I wasn't going to let her struggle. Helping my mother, of course, meant that I wasn't home as much as I used to be. I ended up having to set aside time to take my mother to her treatments, and I ended up staying over at her apartment several nights because I didn't want her to be alone, and I had to shave off a lot of the time that I got to see Lynn. At first, she was fine with it. She hadn't met my mother, but she said she understood, and she was super supportive of me being the one to help her. This lasted for about 2 weeks, until one night I got home. She was sitting in the parking lot waiting for me. I was a bit shocked that she was there since it was like 10 at night, and I hadn't told her I was going to be home that night. The only reason I came home is because my mom told me to go get some sleep in my bed instead of sleeping on her couch, and that she'd be fine. She approached me as I walked up to my apartment, and she seemed happy at first, until I mentioned that I was exhausted. She then immediately started asking me why I was so tired. I told her that I had been helping my mom all day, and that I'd spent the last few hours rearranging furniture to make things more accessible in case my mom got worse. And she came back with, "Are you sure you were with your mom? Are you sure you weren't with another woman?" I will say I may have responded harshly to her when she said this, something about being accused of cheating after I spent a whole day helping my mother, who needed my help, compounded with the stress of my life at the time, just set me over the edge. I went off. I asked who the hell she thought she was to even insinuate that. I called her a few names that I probably shouldn't have, and then I told her to go to hell. Like I said, as much as I really was head over heels for her, I wasn't in a good headspace, and her saying that really messed me up. It was a quick and rash decision to end something that I held dear, but if she was going to go that route while I was dealing with my mother, then I was done. And of course, that wasn't the end of it. In fact, that was where things started to go insane. A couple days later, I got home from work, and as soon as I walked into my apartment, I wanted to freak out. Nothing was taken or broken, but it was pretty clear that someone had broken into my home, and I could pretty quickly figure out who it was. There were post-it notes all over my apartment, stuck to various things, and on each of them was a personal note, but they were such a mixed bag of emotions. For instance, one said something like, "I miss our late nights together," and the next said, "I hope you and your new girl die in a fire." It didn't say girl, it used a different word, but I find it degrading, so I won't include it here. You can figure out what it said. There were, if I remember correctly, 170 something notes all over the place. Clearly, she was a bit unhinged with her unfounded accusations. I called Lynn and asked what her problem was, and she told me that she didn't know what I was talking about. I mentioned the notes, and she just kind of tried to play it off like, "Oh yeah, that. I don't know, I was just in a bad mood." I told her that she had committed a crime by breaking into my apartment, and she laughed and told me that I couldn't prove she did. I once again went off. I told her that I was done with her, that she needed to move on and get over me because I wanted nothing to do with her. She then said that she wanted me to reconsider my statement, and I doubled down, telling her that she needed to leave me alone before I called the cops and got a restraining order. I didn't think I'd actually be able to get one. I just wanted to put it in her head that she needed to leave me alone. That next morning, when I got up to go to my mom's, I went out to my car and, once again, she was waiting in the parking lot. She got out of her car and started to approach me, but I just got in my car and drove off as fast as I could, hoping she would get that I was willing to ignore her existence. She then made it really hard to ignore when I got home and saw a fire axe sticking in my front door. Like it was seriously dug into the wood and just sitting there. That was a really fun conversation to have with the leasing office, that I had to come home to that. They certainly thought it was confusing, and I just had to tell them that I had a nasty breakup. I ended up having to pay them for the door since it was technically vandalism by someone I knew, which was fine. I didn't really care. Over that week, every day when I would leave, I would see her sitting in the parking lot, just staring at me. I wasn't even sure if she was leaving or if she was living in her car in the parking lot just so she could stalk me. What's even more strange was the fact that this went on for about 10 days, and then she was just gone. Just like that. She was no longer in the parking lot, and I never saw her again. Like, at all. She never attempted to contact me again. She never came back, and I have not seen her since that last day. I have no idea what happened to her, or if she just realized that she should move on, or if something actually happened to her, but she has been out of my life completely. While I don't wish harm on anyone, Lynn did put a fire axe through my front door. So to be honest, I don't have a problem with her just disappearing. That's my story about my ex, the woman that I thought was perfect, that went from 0 to 60 on the crazy scale over the matter of a couple days. And over something as dumb as me spending more time with my mother, who was going through cancer treatments. If anyone wants to know, my mother went into remission and has only had one concerning moment since then. Right now she's fully in remission and living a very happy life. I've also gone on to a couple other relationships, but nothing long term. So that, my friends, was a collection of creepy stalker stories. It's always a double-edged sword situation with these stories because we get to hear the experiences of others, which that's why you're here. But then we have to realize that these people exist. These people walk among us, and that's a little unsettling. So I'm gonna just go think of something a little happier. Like a hedgehog, smiling, wearing sunglasses, happily floating along in a pool. That's a lot happier. I like that. Anyways, if you did enjoy this video, please do give it a like. And if you'd like to hear more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe. And you can also leave a comment below telling me your thoughts. But I think that's it for now, so until next time, take care.